All right, everybody. We are here. You're with Christina Previtt, another edition of Wake Up Call Live. And we're talking once again about one of my very favorite subjects as of late is the Johnny Depp versus Amber Heard trial, which I'm a little sad it's over. What are we going to talk about after this? I don't know. We'll have to find maybe some other celebrities will get jammed up and we can talk about them. So joining me for another roundtable series are my friends and colleagues. I'm just going to go down the list here, and then you guys can probably do a better job of introducing yourselves. But joining me is Danielle Laughlin. She is the founding attorney at Sage Business Counsel in Georgia. Also, Derrick Farrell, who is of counsel to the Delaware office of Labaton and Sucharow. Did I say that right, Derrick?
Yeah, yes.
Okay. Had a little trouble with that one. And he does M&As, something very foreign to me, but that's what he does. And Sylvia Breitowich, one of my New Jersey friends and colleagues, she's the founder of the Breitowich Law firm in New Jersey and does exclusively divorce and family law. So thank you guys for joining me today. And I'm going to ask you for your input. It has less to do with your experience as attorneys, although especially for those of you who have some experience with family law, maybe either in your personal lives or in your professional lives, either one. It's really to talk specifically about domestic violence, what experiences you may have had with that. And it's kind of hard to ignore the personal side of things. We've all had different experiences in our lives as we've been watching this relationship unfold so publicly between Johnny Depp and Amber Heard. It's really impossible not to kind of think about some of your own personal experiences and maybe what you've encountered in your practice, because especially doing family law, we encounter a lot of people that are involved in domestic violence situations. Maybe you've handled domestic violence restraining orders, so we have some experience with that. I would say that overall, I think in general, the public doesn't really understand the complex nature of a domestic violence relationship. Would you agree with that? And I guess in general, I want to hear what your initial reactions are to the verdict that we heard yesterday.
So I do think, practicing family law, this was, we were not a stranger to hearing a lot of this stuff that we were hearing. A lot of it was, over the top because you're talking about celebrities. But when you bring it back to what we do, this is triggering for everybody. Everybody has some personal experience with it, whether it is with a client, whether it's yourself or a family member. But it was so different to see a family law trial on TV like this, on court TV, because we never see that. This is all stuff that we see in our small towns, our small court systems, and it's never broadcast so out there. And while this was a defamation suit, this was domestic violence. This is what we were talking about, and that was the big topic of conversation. And it was just really, the verdict I found very interesting because it was just, we were all kind of hedging bets. Like, what do you think it's going to do? Are they just going to dismiss everybody's, or are they going to make everybody responsible for everything and even it out? And I think that in this particular case, the jury loved him and they did not like her. I don't know if it mattered what she said. And what does that mean for someone who does consider themselves a victim, or someone who does consider themselves does not consider themselves a perpetrator? It's a lot, and we see it all the time.
We do.
There's never a clear cut. I shouldn't say never. Very rarely is there a clear cut. This is what happened. This person's a perpetrator. This person's a victim, because it's an emotional, loving, passionate, toxic dynamic. It's not a contract. It's not like we can say A was done, B was done, result is C. It's so intertwined and emotional and tangled. It's just a mess. It's just a mess.
Yeah, I think that pretty much captures it. And I think that parrots what a lot of people think, but I'm curious to hear what Danielle and Derrick think too.
Yeah, well, I'm not a practicing family lawyer, so I definitely viewed this from a different lens, more from a, I think, personal experience, and certainly other friends that do practice family law. And I actually do participate in some divorce litigation when there is a business owner involved, and I represent the business while the business owner has their own representation in that divorce. And I can see this play out, I think, from an intimate third-party perspective, not being, the lawyer for either party in those disputes. And what I noticed about this case, just right off the bat, is exactly what you said. It was more about the personalities, I think, than it was about the actual facts of the case. And sadly for Amber Heard, I believe that she allowed, or maybe was instructed and coached to put on more of a show than was necessary for her to prove her case. And I think that ultimately led the jury to discredit a lot of what she was saying. And that to me is sad. I don't know that many victims will experience that same thing, but certainly it was it had the opposite effect, I think, than what she and her legal team and maybe even her PR team were trying to achieve. And sadly, I do think that because of that, there was a negative message to victims of domestic violence. But also, I firmly do believe that Johnny was also a victim of domestic violence. And I think that, like you both have alluded to in family law, it's often that intertwining of two personalities that makes a relationship toxic. And those individuals don't necessarily show that toxicity and abuse in other relationships. So I think the Kate Moss testimony and the fact that Johnny had these prior relationships that didn't have any public abuse allegations, to me, was given a lot more credit than it really should have been given, because I do believe that the specific personalities and circumstances play a major role in abuse and how it actually cycles in that drama triangle, between two people.
Yeah. I agree with everything you've said too. Derrick, I'm really interested to hear your take too, being the male in the group.
Look, I mean, I come at this from a very different perspective from others, because as you point out, I don't practice in family law. That said, I went through probably one of the messiest divorces of anyone that I've known. I'm probably, 30 to 50 different hearings in at this point, with various matters, and at one point went pro se, which I don't necessarily recommend. Went back, found a great lawyer who I'm really happy with. She did a great job, but I think that puts me in a different perspective than others. I've dealt with the TRO stuff personally on my own and with representation with the ex parte. But with respect to this trial, I think the biggest mistake Amber made was overpromising and underdelivering. When you go through this trial, it was clear to me, I don't know if others have this view, but that she seemed to be clearly lying about certain things and seemed to be very clearly overstating it. And I think as soon as you go down that path and lose your credibility, even if you were in fact abused, the jury's just not going to believe you anymore. And she didn't have anybody that came in to back her up on, what she actually said. And so I think that's what she just beat herself. All she had to do was keep this simple. And I think Johnny did a good job of that. Presumably there was more violence in this relationship than what he presented, and probably than what she presented. There's probably a lot else going on there. And he stuck to the key areas where he seemed to have like the finger issue, right? He's focused on a few very specific things. And I think that was a much better strategy than the one that she did, which I think really hurt her. And in fact, when we look at the verdict, where did they find her? It was a statement about them trashing the penthouse, right? He claimed that her friends were all working together and they're working reporters. And that was the area where, when you look back at it, I didn't see the whole trial, I saw most of it. He didn't really present any evidence on it. So it seemed kind of unsurprising that the jury would say, hey, there doesn't seem to be any support for this, and you didn't really bring anything forward. Although maybe the jury was trying to trade horses here, and that was a compromise, give her something in exchange for another juror, maybe agreeing on the finding on Johnny. But sorry to be long-winded. That's just
not at all. Not at all. I mean, I don't think there are simple yes or no, questions here on this case. But I want to kind of stay focused on the issue of domestic violence, which is the topic. We might go off topic a little. I have a tendency to do that sometimes. But I'm wondering what you guys think. Did this help or hurt Me Too? And this conversation isn't really about Me Too, but I think there's some overlap between domestic violence in general and the Me Too movement, which I talked about in the last Roundtable series. But how do you think that this ties into Me Too and domestic violence in general, just, as a society? What impact do you think it's had for us?
I know there's been a lot of concern for women and domestic violence victims that this is bad for the Me Too movement, but I actually think that it's good for the Me Too movement because I think that it actually gives credence to abuse victims that have. I don't want to go off the line here and say severity as though some abuse is not as good as other abuse. I think that's a risky line of thinking, but to me, I think it actually gives credence to abuse victims who have the evidence that actually can prove what they're saying. And no, you can't always prove it. Sadly, we don't have a perfect justice system. And none of us have, clairvoyance where we can see the future, or even, looking back in hindsight, I don't really think is actually 2020 because you can't always know all the facts. And so in a situation like this, the reality that we have where you can't know all the facts, I think it sends a message to victims that it's important that they gather facts and that they do talk openly to their friends and family, and they do document what they can when they can, because there is a burden of proof in these cases, whether it's a prosecutor prosecuting for DV or whether it is in a private litigation, a civil litigation like this between two parties. There are burdens of proof. And so I actually think it's good that victims can see that they need to bring something to the table. And I think that hopefully in this digital age where we all have our phones with us all the time, that maybe they will be inclined to start to document this stuff more. And I do obviously understand that that's risky in some of these situations, just like the video with Amber and Johnny in the kitchen, and he saw the iPad, and he comes and he swipes the iPad, I mean, it is risky to try to document, but third party decision makers like judges and juries, they have to have something to make a decision on. And this is the best way to keep the real perpetrators accountable and to protect innocent people who are wrongly accused.
You guys, Sylvia, Derrick?
I agree. I mean, I don't think that this really impacted in a negative way the Me Too movement. I think if anything, it kind of opened people's eyes to, everyone has a picture of what they think domestic violence is. They think of all these movies that we've seen with like Julia Roberts and Jennifer Lopez, where it's very dramatic, very banged up, bruises, broken bones, things like that. And I think that this trial helped to show the full array of what domestic violence can really be, from just verbal to physical, not just verbal, but verbal to physical. And having the mental health picture put into this, I think also really, really helps to show that, like Danielle was saying before, that Johnny Depp's prior relationships shouldn't have had such a relevant impact on the outcome, because this particular relationship and the mental health of both of the parties, the substance abuse issues, all had such triggering things that impacted it. And I think that with the Me Too movement, I think initially people were streamlined to think it was men against women. There were certain things that had to be done, certain things that had to be said, certain actions that had to be taken. And I think this sort of opens it up a little bit, that there's a lot of other things that we need to be having conversations about, that there is women on male violence, there is male on male violence, there's female on female violence. There's more than just violence. There's mental abuse, emotional abuse, there's gaslighting, there's other kinds of traumas, and how mental health and substance abuse play a toll into all of that. So I think it's actually good, and I think it's going to be better in the long run. I think right now it seems a little scary that when you are saying you're a victim of domestic violence and all of a sudden no one believes you, it's initially women men, whoever, are very afraid to come forward. But I think once this dust settles a little bit and we can explore all the avenues, I think it's going to help people be more comfortable coming out when it's not, you don't have to show up with a broken nose and a black eye, that you can show up with, the emotional scars, and people are going to understand that too is an issue.
Yeah, I agree.
I mean, I don't see how in theory this should really hurt the Me Too movement, in the sense of, we just saw what happened with Jussie Smollett. And I don't think that harms people that, fully understand LGBTQ plus people are, prejudiced against, and that there's racial prejudice out there. I think the hoax he pulled doesn't undercut all of that. It just shows that there are some people, they're just horrible people that are going to do things like this. I think the Me Too movement, though, has a big opportunity here. And I'm honestly kind of sad to see a lot of people that view this as we have to believe Amanda. Not everyone that claims they were abused is in fact abused. And in fact, a lot of people in divorce litigation in particular use it as a legal tactic to get more property, to get more custody. And so, we need to recognize that. And I'm saddened that a lot of people in the Me Too movement don't seem to be embracing the idea that it does often go the other way, and that people make this stuff up. This isn't something where there's a loss for them. This is an opportunity for the movement to recognize that there are also male victims. And honestly, it's hard for a guy to come out. As of, I think, 2017, there were, 2 DV clinics for men in the entire country. There's nowhere to go. You go in front of a judge, they don't take you seriously. They believe a woman, typically. That's just, in my experience, how it goes these days when you see the two. And that you seem to get a lot of that in the Johnny Depp trial, I think, too, where I think initially there was certainly a lot of disbelief that Johnny was abused. I think perceptions changed, but
I thought that, Johnny, right from the very beginning, and he just, because of the circumstances, because he was the original complainant, he went first. So he got to tell his story first. And he had a lot of other things in his favor. We all know him. We've come to love him, right? I mean, most people are sort of a Johnny Depp fan, and we've known him for decades. Doesn't hurt that he's attractive. Maybe doesn't look quite as good as he used to, but he still looks pretty good, right? And we all love him. So he's sort of a beloved public figure. And he really had that going for him. And he got to go first. He got to tell his story first. And I also think that a lot of the recordings that he had, those corroborated a lot of things and made her look terrible. And something I had talked about last week is my concern just for domestic violence victims in general is, do you have to be a perfect victim? Is that kind of what we've confirmed with everything that we've been watching with Johnny Depp, is you have to be the perfect victim. And Amber, let's assume for a minute that there was mutual domestic violence happening. She wasn't the perfect victim because she was perpetrating it too. So, that's sort of my concern moving forward, is only perfect victims are going to be the ones that are believed and, will get any kind of, I want to say sympathy, but it's not even about that, protection. That's my big concern going forward. And I think perhaps I should have a real mental health professional that specializes in the dynamic of power and control that exists in domestic violence relationships to kind of talk more about that. Can it be mutual? I read an article that said it really kind of suggested it couldn't be, because domestic violence is really about power. And how can both people be wielding the power? Doesn't it really just lie with primarily one of them?
So it's interesting that you say that, because I actually, knowing that we were doing this today, and after the verdict came out, I reached out to a mental health professional who I use a lot of times in cases. And I had asked her, because I said, this portrayed such a toxic relationship. I said, is there ever a relationship, and I know this sounds bizarre, where this toxic relationship is a positive relationship for the two people involved? Because we hear a lot about, and you see it with clients sometimes, that they feed off of this, and when the fighting slows down, they want to fight more. When we're close to the end, they think of something else to fight about. And she said to me, the only way that really works is if you're consenting to that control. And most of the time you're not, because the person either doesn't know there's some kind of personality disorder or something. They don't know what a healthy relationship is. So you're basically saying, like, would this person thrive better in a relationship that has that power and control dynamic, or in a healthier relationship? And she said that it's a lot of, what you were saying, that there's that differential of power, there's the power and control dynamic. And the only way that there's not really like a victim versus a perpetrator is that if someone's consenting to it. So, some people have their thing that they like to do, but if you're talking about more of that power control dynamic in relationships, but those things are consented to. The person who's not in the dominant position is the one that says, like, this is where I draw my line, things like that. And when you're in a domestic violence relationship like this, you don't have that ability necessarily to say, everyone's always, why don't they leave? Well, you don't necessarily have that ability in you because of all the other things that you're going through and that you're suffering. So it's really interesting. Can there be two perpetrators? I think there can. And I think there was here. I think that at the end of the day, there were two perpetrators. I just think that I tend to think, I listened to Johnny Depp, and I think he was more likable. I candidly was watching some of the stuff that he was doing and could think of 10 judges off the top of my head who would not have let him get away with eating candy in the courtroom, laughing, making jokes, and when you're representing the defendant in a domestic violence case, you tell him to do the opposite of that. No rolling your eyes, no smirking when the victim says something. And he was doing all of those opposite things. The jury just loved him. They didn't care what he did. So now, if you're sitting in a county in New Jersey where Christina and I practice, if a defendant does that in front of a judge, they take note of that, and they're thinking, like, maybe this guy did do it. Maybe this woman did do it. Their credibility is shot. And for him, it was just like everyone was starry-eyed. Like, I don't know if she could have presented something that would have been effective.
Yeah, he's Johnny Depp.
Yeah.
He's Johnny Depp.
Like, going into it, I thought he maybe could have done this. He got weird as he got older. He had a lot of substance abuse issues, all this stuff. And he sat on the stand and everyone just went, I believe him. I believe him, and it was just, and like we said earlier, she was so over the top. I think that played against her.
Yeah. And I think what hurt her even more is that she was also, beating on him too, for lack of, like, to put it really bluntly.
Yeah.
And he had overwhelming evidence of that. So rather than us being able to just look at this, like how it's been described by a lot of people, it's just a really toxic relationship. It seems like every potential inference went in Johnny's favor. That's what it seemed to me. What do you think, Derrick?
I take the opposite tack here. I don't think it's because people necessarily love Johnny. And look at him on the stand. He wasn't necessarily a great witness. He was, just didn't present.
I thought he was.
Really?
Yeah.
I started cancer and everything. It wasn't great. It wasn't terrible. I just wasn't overly impressed. But then you look at her and she goes from, these sad face, trying to do the waterworks to she turns on a dime then. As soon as it's up for cross, eyes are teared, she is stone-faced. I thought a few times she was going to eat Vasquez alive. Like, you could see the anger in her. And she's off making the faces too. So at the end of the day, I think her problem was a credibility problem. And, was she abused? From my point, I just don't know. All I know is she's so non-credible. I don't believe a word out of her mouth.
Yeah, I think I agree with you. It's the kind of thing, it's like, that's the reason we have juries and we want people in person, right? We could talk about Zoom hearings. I don't think they're as effective. I just think there's something that's missing when you don't get to see the person live and see their body language. And there's just subtle cues in facial expressions that I think you just miss when it's on Zoom. But the jury was there, right? I mean, they saw this live. They saw all of the interactions, even some of the stuff we didn't get to see. So I agree with you. And most of America, it seems, agrees that she just did not come across as credible. It doesn't necessarily mean that she was lying about everything, but there was just something that seemed inauthentic about the way that she presented her story. And I think what really cemented it for me was towards the end, the crescendo of her story was when, this alleged sexual assault happens and she was crying. It should have been the performance of her life, but there were no tears.
Right.
Yeah, and it was an unbelievable story. I think back to the question that you posed, Christine, about whether abuse can, I'm not an abuse expert, obviously, but I don't know if abuse can actually coexist, but I do think that power and control does coexist. And if these two people were both trying to control the other person, then they can end up in a situation where two abusive and controlling personalities are abusing each other. And so that's why I don't think in this situation we have a true victim and a true perpetrator. I think they were sharing these hats a lot. And that drama triangle that I talked about before, that's very common, right? There's the perpetrator and the victim, and then there's some rescuer, a friend, one of Johnny's employees. Somebody comes in to rescue the victim, but then that victim turns right around and becomes the perpetrator, right? And so it's just this dramatic triangle that people get into, and when they have especially personality disorders or codependency issues, substance abuse, I mean, things where you're not really thinking clearly and there's some obstruction through your emotional processing, that's where this sort of thing occurs. And the stories that she told to me, I mean, the sexual violence one was the one that really was the icing on the cake in terms of her credibility. I mean, her allegation was extreme. I mean, she alleged that she was literally raped with a glass bottle and that it broke, and that she had cuts in her genital area, and that she was in severe pain, and yet she sought no medical treatment. That to me was the moment where I just stopped listening to everything that she said. There was no reality where that could occur. That I don't even know that could occur for somebody who doesn't have her access to help and money and healthcare and all the things. I mean, even for women that are in extreme poverty, you can get seen, right? You can get to an ER, you can call a 911, you can run to a neighbor. There's a way most of the time to get out and seek that medical treatment. So that story in and of itself was the moment that I just, and maybe she was exaggerating because of the title of, the title of that article was the one that was about the sexual abuse, and whether, did she say it or was it her words? I think that was one of the questions they were debating in the jury. But yeah, that one was where I sort of.
Well, I think the other thing too that's important here, and probably in most cases like it, is she, at least according to Johnny's expert, has borderline personality disorder. And I spoke to a mental health professional about that in the past couple of weeks, and she indicated that would certainly color this whole experience and the way that Amber experienced it. Because now Amber is releasing statements that, she wants to speak her truth, that she did speak her truth, that she's being punished. And a lot of the reaction is, but you're lying, Amber. But I think that she does believe everything that she has said. So in her mind, and I don't know, where the personality disorder begins or ends, but she believes that this happened to her. She believes that she is speaking her truth. She believes that she is a victim of domestic violence. So it kind of becomes like, well, did these things really happen, or is it just the way she's colored it? I guess we'll never know. I just because Johnny's expert diagnosed her, officially diagnosed her, doesn't mean that, I'm kind of curious, what would somebody else? We'll never know. I'm sure she'll never tell us. But how do you think that plays into it too? I mean, I'm wondering if there's statistics on that. How many people that are in these kinds of relationships do have personality disorders?
I think there's a high number, and I've experienced that personality disorder in my personal life. I've seen this personality up close and personal, and it is extravagant. There are these kind of there's kind of these, what I understand about it anyway, is kind of these three roles, especially for women, and women are largely diagnosed more than men with this particular disorder. But there's the queen, can't do anything wrong, dictating, telling other people what to do. Then there's the witch, the persecuting, verbally abusive personality. And then there's the waif, the woe is me and that sort of thing. And what I understand, again, I'm not an expert, but what I understand about is that this personality can take on these 3 different channels at any time. And sometimes those personalities are more one than the other. But I noticed on the stand, there was a lot of all 3. I mean, she, at one point it was, I'm just, I'm so victimized here. And then at the other point, she was like, I've never considered myself a victim. Right. And so it's like, well, you're saying you're a victim, but then you're saying, but I'm not, it was sad. It was really sad almost to witness that, knowing, kind of seeing that in my own life and watching her kind of morph into these different personalities.
You know what else was disturbing for me is everybody was talking as though the relationship is over, but it's not.
No.
They were still there. They were living it out. It is not over for them, for either one of them. Because if it was over for Johnny, he wouldn't have been there, wouldn't have been in court, right? He hasn't moved on with his life, but neither has she, because she's still talking about it too. And I fear that they are going to be that couple. Sylvia will definitely know what I'm talking about. They just battle it out forever. They are never done. There's always something new to fight about. And it just seems to me that they might be one of those couples. Thank God they don't have kids together.
Right. Right.
Really.
But, I hope moving forward, the message that our society hasn't gotten is that, domestic violence victims shouldn't come forward. That they shouldn't seek help, especially if they're not the perfect victim. I mean, are any of you afraid that that's happened?
I think so. I think you have to be. I mean, whether you agree with how it played out, whether you think she was a victim or he was a victim, and neither one of them, it's not common that you see this type of trial brought out so publicly. So I think it is, for someone who is a true victim, I think it's scary. And for someone who has been on the other end, the receiving end of a restraining order that was falsified, I think this whole dynamic was terrifying because there was a lot at stake. So I think, I hope that it works in a way of giving people more courage instead of discouraging them. But I think that it falls on, the legal system and the community that we need more services. I mean, I think that's ultimately what it comes down to. There needs to be better access to mental health services. There needs to be better and cheaper, more affordable access to therapeutic services. And that needs to be more broadcast to like a general population, not just a certain type of person who can have access to it. Because I mean, these are 2 celebrities. They had all the resources available to them that they wanted. This plays out a lot in everyday life, that people that can't afford to go see a therapist for a couple $100s an hour, that's not covered under insurance, and I think that's what we need to take away from it. Like these were 2 multi-millionaires. That's not what we normally see in the courthouse. If that was what we saw all the time, people would look at domestic violence differently, but that's not what we're seeing. And a lot of people don't have access to these fancy legal teams to defend them and put their case forward.
Yeah.
And they're talking themselves up there to a judge.
But you know what? I think in some ways they weren't a lot different than other couples that might be experiencing this, because there's still shame and embarrassment, just because I think we have a tendency to just put public figures up on this pedestal, but at the end of the day, they are human beings.
Right.
And I think there's still shame associated with it,
Right.
Especially for men. I meant to bring this up earlier, Derrick, when you were talking, is that, I think there's sort of a double whammy for men that are victims of domestic violence, because they still have the usual shame and embarrassment. But now, men are supposed to be macho, right? Like we have all ascribed those kinds of roles to men, is that they're not supposed to be victims of domestic violence. They're not masculine if they are. And I think oftentimes they are believed less for various reasons. Derrick?
For me, at least, the belief issue was the real problem. I don't think there's a lot of shame in coming out anymore. I think it's changed really on both sides. But a lack of believability is a huge problem. and not believed by police, not believed by anyone, and not taken seriously. I had a judge once ask me, in a hearing on a DV issue, what my height and weight was. What does that have to do with anything? My 8-year-old could shoot you with a gun. It doesn't have anything to do with it. So I think believability currently is really the biggest problem. And it's a discouraging factor for men to come forward too, right? I mean, like if I were to come back, the police are there and they don't haul her off. Now my kids are there alone and maybe they take me away. And that's a real problem.
Well, I also think that also as humans, and we do this in all contexts, not just domestic violence, we kind of have a natural tendency to just assume that however we might react in a situation, that everybody else does that too.
Yes.
I find myself doing it. I have to catch myself. Just because I might react a certain way doesn't mean that that's how Sylvia or Danielle or Derrick or anybody else would react. And I disagree. I do think there's still a lot of shame because I see a lot of clients, men and women, who will say, Sylvia, I'm sure you've heard this. Oh, you must think I'm an idiot.
Oh yeah.
Like a mom who doesn't know where the bank accounts are, or even a dad. Sometimes it's the dad. You must think I'm an idiot.
Right.
No, I don't think you're an idiot.
We get that a lot. And how many times do you have, and I can say in all the years that I've been doing this, I've had, in my personal experience as an attorney, more what I and have been deemed as not real domestic violence issues, whereas the ones that are real don't want to come forward and don't want to, let's just get the divorce finalized. I don't want to go to the police. I don't want to file. This is going to be more of a hassle. We have children. Whereas, like Derrick, like you were saying, it's so easy just to be like, oh, I Googled that. How do I get an advantage in a custody case? Oh, I'm going to say this happened at the house. And so it's such I think we're starting to operate from a place of maybe is the victim being genuine? And then you see stuff like this. And I think I think it throws everybody for a loop. No one knows what to do anymore.
I want to just piggyback on that, Sylvia, because also I think on the flip side for the alleged perpetrator, they made a big deal out of Johnny's substance abuse issues and his addiction and things like that. And do you have to be the perfect perpetrator? What is it exactly that folks are looking at? And I really think Derrick's point is exactly the truth. This is about credibility.
100%.
A lot of people can't get all the way to that jury in a divorce, right? Because it's very expensive. So a lot of people aren't actually able to necessarily achieve the credibility event, which is that trial, right? The trial is where the credibility really comes out. And they had the means to do that. And I do think, sadly, our system is, it's at a place now where that's increasingly more difficult and more expensive. And I also do agree with what you said, Christine, about the shame, because that happens. I think Derrick and I do business work, but that happens with business people. You must think I'm an idiot. I got into this partnership with this person. And these personality dynamics play out in those business relationships just as much as they do in a romantic relationship. And there are often perpetrators, right? There are often people alleging things to become a victim in order to gain an advantage. So I think credibility really is it. Sadly, I just wish that our system would be a little bit more accessible for average people that don't have the means.
Resources.
You know what, though? I wonder if the accessibility that we're talking about is really just in the form of education. Because we're talking about people that would go and seek out services, right? But what about the people that aren't seeking out service? They're not even trying. They're not even thinking about it because they don't even recognize that they're in a domestic violence situation.
Right.
And we could have an hour-long conversation just about that, but we all come from varied backgrounds. A lot of people that have experienced domestic violence, they grew up in homes where there was domestic violence. That's normal to them. They don't even know that this is not normal, that other people don't live that way. It's kind of like it reminds me of the just say no public service announcement that, Nancy Reagan started way back, and they kind of determined that, that specific service didn't really work. But I think it's more about education. So I don't know how to implement that.
I mean, I think in PA, at least, there are two different angles here. One is straight up DV, unassociated with a divorce or custody type situation. And at least in Pennsylvania, I don't know what your states, but in Pennsylvania, you go in, you get that TRO, and you will have a lawyer representing you that you don't have to pay for. So it's accessible to get that protection, at least in Pennsylvania. And in fact, when it goes to the actual hearing, you can also have a lawyer represent you there that's appointed, like free, no expense. For me, and the more difficult thing is when it's allowed to be able to be used to economically influence a divorce. And maybe there's not a good way of disentangling that, but if you can take the DV and separate it from the economics, it's much obviously harder to separate from custody because it's kind of one and the same. But I think that would help. If somebody couldn't use, like in Pennsylvania, you could get a TRO, get the other person out of the house, and then refuse to split up any of the property for 2 years. And there's nothing they can do. You have to go buy an entire new house of furniture. And at the same time, you can freeze the bank accounts until they're distributed. And there'll be some amount kind of set aside for everyone to live. But most of the assets can be frozen, and that can also stick for up to 2 years. And so at least to me in PA, like that's a big problem when someone can use that economically. And I think it'd be hopeful if they'd fix the law. But from what I'm seeing from the reaction of everyone else, sounds like that's not how it works in New Jersey.
No.
Or Georgia. I mean, it's interesting because it's like they have like PA has, you could get this representation in a civil matter. I'm wondering I assume it's a civil matter, and maybe there's just a local government or maybe a statewide program that gives that.
You just go to the courthouse and someone helps you fill out the forms and then goes in front of the court and makes the arguments for the TRO, and then they assign someone. I don't know how it works. I believe it's paid for by the state is how they're funded. I don't think
you have to demonstrate financial need.
No.
Wow.
Okay, so you could make $1 million a year and you get that.
Correct.
Almost like a victim advocate.
Yeah. I would imagine it's very similar, although it's a lawyer. I think victim advocates can be non-lawyers.
Do both sides get that, or just the person who's requesting the TRO?
The other problem, only one side gets it. And if you're the first person to the courthouse, good luck for the second person getting someone appointed.
Yeah.
Because there are going to be conflicts and problems there.
Well, you know what I've often thought is our whole system, our divorce system is just not set up to really assist people that are in these kinds of situations, a divorce or domestic violence situation. These are mental health issues. These are not legal issues. Yes, there's some law involved, but I think Sylvia will agree. I'm going to go out on a limb here, but probably 2% of what we do is law, and the rest of it is almost serving like a therapist / mediator.
Yep.
So it's interesting to me that we have these people that come to a courthouse to address problems that are really only legal in nature by about 2%. We have to completely overhaul the system. I don't know how we do that. I think there would be a lot of resistance, especially from divorce lawyers who make a lot of money doing what we do.
I don't know. Because I was just thinking about that when Derrick was saying that they appoint someone. I think how many of our colleagues, that we talk to don't want to handle domestic violence matters anymore because they're too costly for the clients because of all the appearances that you have to make, all the preparation. And we want to focus on making sure we deal with custody issues and all of the other things to get someone up on their feet. If there was a program where everyone got their attorney for the DV and that was handled separate and apart, I would like it better.
Yeah.
Well, I think that maybe the reason a lot of attorneys don't want to handle the DVs is because if a case starts out with a DV, it's just screaming high conflict.
Right.
This is a high conflict case. This
Right.
is not one that's going to probably be resolution oriented. And a lot of attorneys just don't want to deal with that.
Yeah.
Or maybe there's a way where we could offer attorneys additional education and resources if they did find that this was part of their practice that they enjoyed, but they just felt they were ill-equipped to handle, maybe. I mean, it seems like there should be a way to merge kind of that, DHS stuff into these services with like a step process, like, initial filing. Does this case involve domestic violence? If so, it's like a pretrial diversion almost to kind of go over to this other, alternative place. And then, the attorneys can seek that certification, I guess.
We should do that, Sylvia. Let's do that.
I would do it.
Start a movement. I don't know who we have to talk to around here, but we have to change the system. It doesn't work. It's not working. It's supposed to be resolution oriented, right? People come to court with a problem, right? That's really what they have, is a problem that needs a solution.
Yeah.
But they're in the wrong place. It just doesn't resolve this. It just doesn't provide a solution. So I know, probably preaching to the choir, but the law is always very far behind where our society actually is. So it'd be nice to see it catch up. But I want to thank you all for your time and your experience and your expertise. Thank you for coming on the show. I'd love to have you on again if you guys want to revisit this topic or another one. I have a feeling we're going to be seeing Depp v. Heard again in the future. I don't think this is over. But for my viewers, thank you for watching. And I'm going to have links to all the fine attorneys here websites, so that if you want to check them out a little further, you can do that. And thank you for watching or listening, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Christina.
Thanks, Christine. Bye, everybody.